is we are beginning on Badiou's Logics of Words. This is a book that Badiou wrote in 2006 after 13 years of wait between being an event and this book. It's really a continuation of what the previous book was doing, and therefore it bears the name Being an Event, Volume 2. It has a preface. Today we are going through the preface, and this is my notes on the preface. So I think we are doing this the first time. This is the first session. So we go like the natural flow everywhere that you need to stop me or intervene and either provide a comment or ask questions, please feel free to do so. So the first section of this is democratic materialism and materialistic dialectic. Badiou opens up with, like dives into the statement that today natural belief is condensed in a single statement. There are only bodies and languages. Badiou calls this conviction the democratic materialism, or DM. One other possible name for this conviction is postmodern. Badiou announces this as being the enveloping ideology for the new century. There is a correspondence between the terms of statement and the terms of the name. So body corresponds to materialism and language corresponds to democratic. Body is our vehicle of enjoyment. It is what makes us a living being, and it is where our finitude is inscribed. Because of the dominance and importance of the body in this form of materialism, you have the doxa of existence equal to individual, equal to body. Insofar as we are in possession of a body, we are a member of the animal kingdom whose normative sense is regulated by bioethics, and our materialism today is therefore a biomaterialism. The current materialism is also democratic insofar as there is a consensus on the plurality of the languages without one dominating or regulating all bodies. A train of language constitutes a subspecies of the human animal as a species, and the bodies regulated under languages have juridical equality. One of the central aims of this book is to provide a scientific examination of democratic materialism. However, the examination carried out herein is in fact opposite to the usual examination.
Sorry. Yeah, sure.
Should I continue?
Yeah, I think so. I think somebody made a mistake of not muting themselves just there. Okay.
However, the examination carried out herein is in fact opposite to the usual examination and critique of democratic materialism performed by aristocratic idealism, either of the communist ilk or inspired by nostalgia of a return to the glories that have come to pass. This examination is philosophical, in whose essence elaborates the means of saying yes to the previously unknown thoughts that hesitate to become the truths that they are. Badiou posits the name materialist dialectic for the examination underway in this book. So instead of a materialism, the priority of bodies that is dialectical, regulated under normative equality of plurality of language, you have a dialectic that is materialist. What does this new term designate? It designates the following statements. There are only bodies and languages except there are truths. First, this statement adds a third term to the duality of body and language, which is truth, which supplements the reality of the truth. Second, the term truth, like the other two terms, has a reality of its own, albeit not quite the same modality of being modality of being as bodies and languages, as we will see below. That is reality that is in excess of the reality designated by the other two terms. In other words, the existence of truth is supported by empirical evidence. Third, the constituents of what constitute the reality of truth are still bodies and languages that are devoid of meaning and are generic infinities and unconditioned supplements. Fourth, as the syntax implies, the existence of truths is an exception to what there is. That which makes up the structure of words that is what makes up the structure of words is a mixture of bodies and languages. Truths interpolate themselves into the continuity of what there is. Fifth, democratic materialism expresses that there is only one substance, which is body, and one principle of organization, which is language. In that sense, DM is an ontology that emphasizes on what exists, which is bodies, and how they exist, which is languages. Materialist dialectic emphasis, on the other hand, is on what is an exception to what the DM ontology delineates. That is, what there is that the DM cannot account for, which is obviously truths. Badiou's reference to Descartes is illuminating. It begs the question how much the democratic materialism is a Cartesian project. Bodies and languages seemingly map to two substances with attributes and attributes of extension and thought. Yet Badiou illustrates that even if they seem to map to the Cartesian dualism of body and mind, they fall short of inexistent component of truth in the Cartesian philosophy. According to Badiou, Descartes believed in eternal truths that exist in the same modality as bodies and minds. Truths exist in thought. Bodies and minds that exist individually. There is no universality of existent substances. Substances exist individuated and separately. However, truths, according to Descartes, exist universally. So in the sense in which substances exist, they really inexist. To Descartes, they have a logical existence. So this is a quote, like every genuine philosopher, Descartes registers at the point where ontology and logic rub up against each other, the necessity of what we have chosen to call materialist dialectic. And this rubbing off of ontology and logic is of importance in this book. We see later on how Badiou says the line of inquiry in this book, in contrast to being an event, is a logical inquiry, as opposed to ontological inquiry, which was in volume 1 of Being an Event.
Reza, can I just ask you a question?
Sure.
I mean, it's a question that I have regarding Badiou, and maybe it's a question of some other people as well. Three terms that have been talked about up until now, which are bodies, languages, and truth, right? Mm-hmm. There seems to be, it's obvious that it is the case, but it seems to be, only with the information given, that truth has somewhat exceptional meaning in Badiou's sense, which is not the normal meaning, so to speak, that, you know, if I say there is a computer on my table and this is true. This is not a truth in the sense of Badiou, right?
Correct.
So I was wondering if you could just flesh out a little bit about what does it mean to have something else that is not bodies and language, but it is a truth in that
Correct.
sense.
Sounds good. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is really volume 2 of Badiou's repertoire of ontology or his main theory. The discussion of what truth is, the being of truth, or in some way the definition of truth, is something that is elaborated in the first volume of Being an Event. And in that volume, as you mentioned, JP, truth basically gets a very specific meaning in Badiou's corpus, and that is, given a situation of being, and all situations of being for Badiou are infinite in size, there is always within that situation of being an element or elements, we can say, that are also of infinite size, that are indiscernible by the state of the situation, meaning that the knowledge of that situation, whatever that knowledge is, could not account for an element which is the member of that situation. That indiscernible element within each situation to Badiou is the truth of that situation. So truth of a situation is a member of a situation of being, and a situation of being is any established enclosure has an exception, which is mathematically, it's called a generic subset. And that exception to Badiou bears the name truth. Now, Badiou provides various different examples for this in Being an Event. The examples are more or less all, the ones that I remember are all political and very classic. So for example, Badiou reappropriates the term proletariat as the bearer of the name for a situation of being within the capitalist society that has no inclusion, or I should say any index within the knowledge in the capitalist kind of repertoire of what there is. So in short, truth is not a logical term, is a term that its existence or being is linked to ontology for him, although the name truth is not an ontological term, but at the same time, it is something that is embedded with in a situation of being.
Can I just perhaps add something here? Because, I mean, I think Reza gave the technical explanation, but I think that there is something that is already very hard to follow in this preface if you're not, if you don't keep this in mind. And I have the impression that it clarifies something very weird that Reza selected from the preface to very in passing, he mentioned that Badiou says that, okay, everyone recognizes that there are bodies and languages, and he in no moment in the, either in the preface or throughout the whole book, will put into question that this is a coherent belief. That's why he calls it a materialist position, right? He's not going to put that into question. He's going to supplement it. I think we could, I was waiting first to finish the section, but I think it's worth mentioning that 80% of the book is dedicated to giving the most radical and absolutely extravagant version of an ontology where, or of a view of worlds where there are only bodies and languages. So the book is not, as Reza said, it is a scientific treatment of this thesis. So if you consider, for example, object-oriented ontology, flat ontology, where everything is supposed to have legitimacy of existing, the proposal of Being an Event is a more radical version of that same thing, because he's departing from the same topic. But then he says something that I think is very important, is that he says, it's not that this is the empirical thing, and then truths are the, platonic ideal thing I'm trying to add. He says that there are empirical evidences to truth existing.
Yeah, this is the what was going to be my next question, my next point.
But I think this is important for two reasons, because what's contained in Reza's answer and his summary of what being an event proposes is that when you Badiou's definition of truth, or his proposal of a concept of truth, includes within it, as a weaker sense that he calls the veridical, the correlation is about correspondence theory of truth, right? So this is not opposed to the correspondence theory of truth, like, for example, a more Heideggerian kind of continental approach to truth usually is. Like, you have knowledges, and then truth is this opening to something indiscernible, totally different. So we can refer back to empirical situations or experience where this concept, this stronger concept of truth, shows itself to be useful, right? And I think that this is something that is always useful to discuss before going into the whole machinery of Badiou's philosophy, because if you don't consider these experiences, or if you're not interested in them, his philosophy is pretty uninteresting and unnecessarily complicated. And the sort of experience he's talking about is this sort of situation where your recognition of something is part of that thing, meaning the subjective engagement with the thing is part of what makes it what it is, right? Like a relationship, love relationship is not only something, but you saying it is something is part of what makes it something, right? Makes it, and the way you do that and you defend that it exists participates in the singularity of what it is. It's not like a statement. So there is a statement of what we could call that something is veridical, in the same sense that a computer is in front of you. So that is included in that there. But you need something else to be able to say things like this in a very similar sense to the correspondence theory of truth, that also is also in dialogue with the performative theory of Austin and all those guys. In the cases where this sort of engagement, or the process of sustaining something, constitutes what it is, right? So this is the sort of thing that he says, look, everyone knows this. This cannot be totally explained away by languages or bodies, right? So I think it's a good kind of preamble, because the whole language of this preface is so heroic and is so full of exceptionalism and so full of that sort of approach, which is, I think it says a lot about Badiou's own rhetoric and his preference for certain poets and things like this, right? It gives it such a heroic and exceptional tone that you forget sometimes that, as he textually says, right, it's something about it's not an anti-empiricist rationalist approach to sort of ideals and things like this. It's very much, there's part of our experience, certain things, or whatever you want to call them, and Badiou calls them truths that have this weird structure. And what sort of formal and conceptual mechanisms you need in order to account for that sort of experience. So I think that helps to kind of settle the whole discussion into something that is more, recognizable, even though the way that he describes things sometimes make them seem very extraordinary, right? But yeah, I have a lot of comments, but I would rather wait until we finish that section of the text. Yeah,
there are also some comments in the chat sidebar, but maybe we'll take them afterwards.
Yeah, I think we should with all respect to everyone, I think we should follow that idea that let's privilege the three circles of the different dynamics we're superimposing. But I see that there are a lot of interesting questions. Yeah.
So continue.
Yep.
So in fact, then Cartesianism is not quite what infamously thought as dualism. It is indeed, as Badiou think, is a trialism. Therefore, while at the surface, the dictum, there are only bodies and languages, seem to be a statement that fits into Cartesianism, a true Cartesian will say there are only bodies and languages except there are truths. This firstly points to the three modalities of being, bodies, languages, and truths. And secondly, it points at the exceptional character in which truths are. Truths do not exist in the same way in which bodies and languages exist as being there. But you then fast forwards to some of the currents developed in 20th century as the handmaiden of democratic materialism, such as phenomenology or linguistics. He says, the materialist dialectics only exists to the extent that it plows the gap which separates it on its right flank from the diktats of authenticity and on its left from the humanities of critique. What is nice in the above quote is how Badiou sums up the philosophical tradition in 20th century as a sort of dualism between authenticity, phenomenology, existentialism, and critique, analytical philosophy, and linguistic, and maps them into the dictum of democratic materialism. Our philosophical destiny, the destiny of human being, is torn between living in authenticity and critique. But you emphasizes that the leitmotif for these orientations of democratic materialism is their commitment to the finitude of thought, which to Badiou is what bestows the attribute of modesty to all different schools of democratic materialism. Encountering this finitude, materialist dialectic is joined by the vitalist tradition from Bergson to Deleuze, who were also fervent advocates of the infinite rights of thought. Both democratic materialism and vitalist orientations propose an ontological break with democratic materialism.
Yeah, you mean both dialectics and yeah, you said it otherwise. You said the opposite.
Yeah, both
yeah,
democratic materialism and vitalist orientation propose an ontological break with democratic materialism, yes. But an ontological break with the democratic materialism is not enough. In other words, it's not enough to show that there is another modality of being according to which truths are, which is what being an event did. It is also necessary to show that truths exist and appear in worlds. In this sense, if being an event is like Hegel's science of logic that disclose the process of thought, that thinks being qua being, logic of words is like Hegel's phenomenology of spirit that disclose the process of thought when it thinks consciousness. This is first and foremost to understand that truths for their appearance are dependent on subjects and subjective operations. This means that while a variant of the statement of democratic materialism can be stated as there are only individuals and communities, materialist dialectic opposes the statement the universality of truths rests on subject forms that cannot be either individual or communitarian, or to the extent that it is subject of a truth, a subject subtracts itself from every community and destroys every individualism. You want to give any comments before I go to the next section?
Comment section per section. Caron, you said you...
No, I think no.
At this point, you don't want to ask any questions?
Yeah, I don't have any questions.
Okay, I have a couple of comments that I think are relevant. First is that I think he mentions this very briefly, but I think Reza, we talked about this a couple of times in the past, especially you use this in your book. And I think that this is actually quite relevant but you ended up choosing a term that I think, like, to call this a materialist dialectic. I think that it both refers to Althusser's text for Marx, right? Which is not a very common expression. I don't think you easily find within Marxism or indeed within anywhere else other than that particular text. I don't know of any other references of people making that distinction between where materialism, where dialectics is shifted from dialectical materialism to that other to this new expression. And in Althusser's text, which is called Dialectical Materialist Dialectic, or the Unevenness of Origins, or something like this. It's interesting because if you follow the text, it's clear that some of Althusser's concerns with why this is needed, right? I mean, and his text is actually very confusing, because unlike Badiou, who says we're leaving dialectical materialism aside, this is kind of a stillborn project. He complains about it in Being an Event and so on. Althusser was trying to keep both, so the text is very confusing, because sometimes he's speaking about dialectical materialism, sometimes about the materialist dialectics that dialectical materialism requires. It is interesting because first, I think that the approach that Badiou is proposing is very, very telling of what I think also you, Reza, in your book called regionalization, because he's not proposing to critique democratic materialism in the sense of this is a project that has the wrong presuppositions in terms of the very foundations of what it's proposing. He says it's pretty much okay. Everyone agrees with this. Nobody believes in a separate soul. Nobody believes in that there is something out of this world. So he accepts the basic coordinates of this, and then he suggests that this is just poor in terms of its reach, right? This is a strategy you see Badiou deploying in many fields. For example, his position within debates of philosophy of mathematics, for example, concerning should one adopt an intuitionist reading, should one be a constructivist, or things like this. And he proposes this idea of, no, we should adopt the principle of maximality, he calls it, right? If you can think it consistently, it should be accepted. It has the similar sort of strategy, which is not a critical strategy, right? It is a strategy that I think has a different kind of genealogy, where rather than showing that the opposite position has the wrong presuppositions in terms of how it constitutes its entity, he will suggest that it affirms a principle that you can negate, and when you negate it, you get a larger system, right? So the problem with materialist dialectic is that it only accepts languages and bodies, and not that those two concepts or two operators are wrong, or they shouldn't be, or they come up with a incoherent view of the world or a mystifying view. The problem concerns the limits that come along with that, right? So rather than, and I think that's also very telling. I mean, it's a very kind of subtle way of putting it, but I think that you can tell who he was talking about when he says, well, people usually in a kind of leftist tradition, or a radical tradition philosophically, they oppose this view with aristocratic idealism. And then he mentions Heidegger, which I think it's perhaps easy to understand. But Debord, for me, who is the other guy he mentions it, is clearly standing in for a Frankfurt School approach in general, you know, like as a sort of the latest of the radical critical theorists in a certain sense, with this idea that everything went to shit. People don't really have a space for this beautiful, amazing things, because everything was reduced to bodies and languages, and postmodernity this and that, and we should preserve something that is only kind of aristocratically accessible to a few who still cling to this or that. And I think that it's very interesting that he avoids this, which I think is a critical kind of critical approach to authenticity, or to the limits of bourgeois critique or whatever. And he adopts this other view, which I think is very coherent throughout his work, which I think he would call affirmationist, right? Which is to say, which is very, you can see it very clearly in Being an Event, with the way that he deals with, for example, opposing different orientations in thought and saying, okay, the constructivist is not wrong. Of course, it's a coherent view of the world that you only, or a coherent view of the universe of sets, that you only accept sets that can be constructed through well-defined predicates. But you can also do more than that. right? So he's not challenging the construction, the internal coherence of a proposal. He's challenging what sort of limit that proposal is implying in terms of what there is, right? I think there was a comment here on the kind of an implicit reference to Quine on this preface. I like that idea, right? So I think it's a different strategy. It's not a critical strategy really, right? So there is a sort of interesting positioning with regards to the thing that he's opposing, which is not really an opposition in terms of debunking it or something like this, right? And I think that's an interesting aspect of it. Another thing that I think is also useful to mention, and perhaps that interests me more particularly, but I'm curious to what you guys think. I mentioned that I think sometimes Badiou's rhetoric gets in the way of the conceptual development. I feel like he's clearly somebody who owes a lot to a very particular kind of formation, intellectual formation. So he, for example, he has this critique of modesty in this first section, right? He says there's too much modesty in the way the democratic materialism presents itself. And the problem for me is that I understand it. If you understand it in terms of it sets out a limit for what there is that is poor in what it accepts. We can't consistently accept the existence of more things, and he calls this addition truth. I understand the modesty, but on the other hand, it gives the kind of flavor to everything that follows. The idea that there is a sort of heroism, or the sort of it makes it hard to remove from especially from the whole discussion on fidelity, events, and so on, the idea that we're always dealing with big things and spectacular things, right? Truths are this spectacular thing, and I think that it's important to see that this is totally unsupported by the way that he actually constructs conceptually a process of truth, or what an event is, or radical change, or anything like this. There's absolutely nothing to support the idea that post-mental bodies or subjects or anything like this are big spectacular things that involve amazing intensity or anything like this, right? So I find this an interesting contradiction, that he doesn't have a better way to express what he means by these are poor ontologies, so to speak, in the sense that they are okay with very little, with allowing for very little, that he doesn't have a better way to express this than by referring to modesty or immodesty or heroism and things like this in a way that kind of I think that gives a weird kind of flavor to everything that comes after, that is a bit mystifying, you know, and helps poor readings of his work.
Yeah, I think there's a reason for that, and it is connected to the polemical tone of the preface.
Yeah, true.
This democratic materialism is actually the enemy, right? So sometimes it might not be that clear, but this is actually the enemy, but it is a quite close enemy. It's an enemy that is not completely different from what he's trying to defend, as you yourself are saying, that he was so, but he's trying to make room for something that is, in a sense, of this heroic type of thing that he calls truth. Even if we can understand truth not as the veridical, which we established earlier. It's not just the veridical, but it's not. Nevertheless, it's either not a big, all-encompassing event necessarily, right? But nevertheless, the idea is to sustain that there is more to this kind of contemporary doxa. So maybe he pushes too hard in the direction of his heroic tone because of the polemical target of the text.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I do think that there is a level of, sorry, was anyone speaking and I, sorry, yeah, no. I do think that there is a good reason to I mean, there is a good argument for a recuperation of some level of excitement over big things and things that are great and things like this. And I do think that there is a commitment in his work to making these things legitimate in a time of excessive, it's not, I wouldn't say modesty, but perhaps some other term, like, and definitely an anxiety over claiming that you're engaged with something that is great and in an effective way that is not just a rhetorical.
Yeah,
But
it's almost like democratic materialism is this term for capitalist realism, something like that in a sense.
no, I would agree with that, though I think that it's larger. That's also one thing I wanted to mention before we move on. And I think that in this preface, this is not very clear, but it becomes clear later on. And Reza also singled that out in his summary, that books 2 to 5, which deal with worlds, relations, transcendental, they propose in the same way that Being an Event did. Like, people, I mean, we had this sort of strategy of constructing the argument before, right? People say, okay, things are relative to situations and context. And then Badiou said, okay, you think this, so let's construct a model where we take that idea that you just mentioned, that is supposed to be the pinnacle of postmodern relativism, let's take it to the extreme. And I don't know, 200 pages of Being an Event are the most extreme possible view of what it means for situations to be multiple, right? It's not a defense against it. It's a formulation of it, right? So I think that Badiou's version of democratic materialism is as good as it gets a defense of there are only bodies and languages. And he will show that what he means by language is this weird greater logic thing, which encompasses much more than what we are ready to accept as bodies and languages, right? So it's really, really expensive. And still, even if you have such a rich view of you're ready to accept things that no Graham Harman would accept as an object, we are going to accept as objects, right? We're going to have a really, really rich kind of vast view of this, and still we won't be able to prevent, you know. So if you go, I think this complements this view of a strange strategy or different strategy to critique or to oppose contemporary ideology. First, he doesn't take it as mystification. He takes it as a coherent organization of ideas about the world. Second, he tries to formulate the most radical version of it, which already displaces some fixed views we have of it. So he gives it its best presentation, let's say, and then he says, okay, but more things are possible if you accept this, right? So I think that's a useful thing to have in mind. That
I think that also plays into the the expression of modesty, that he basically says that let's put the modesty aside, let's take this to its maximum extension.
mm-hmm.
And it's only when you take it to the maximum extension is where you actually start seeing things that only an expression of bodies and languages cannot cover.
Yeah, but I think it's also hard to kind of it's hard to keep that with the fact that he chose two things that I think are relevant. One is to spend more than half of the preface with what is now the section 2, which is a didactic of eternal truths, which at the same time he says are empirical, right? He says I can give empirical evidence that this exists. So first he chose to say, guys, you know what I'm talking about. Like, you know, these things are there. Philosophy is that lagging behind in giving it a proper formulation, right? And then he's both says they're empirical, gives us a bunch of examples, and most of the prefaces are like examples of this thing, and then decides to start book 1 by discussing subjectivity, right? It doesn't give us this only at the end as a sort of thing that you will only understand what's at stake if you understand everything that follows before. I think it's a very interesting thing that in the order of reasons, he leaves the subject to the end and truth to the end. But at the level of rhetorics and the level of addressing people and how to invite people into the project, he puts it in the beginning in the sense that this is somehow evident or, you know, just something everyone can experience, right?
Continue.
Sure. So the next section in the preface is of didactics of eternal truth. As Gabriel mentioned, it is important methodologically. It's important to see how Badiou is doing this. He's not providing any clear definition of what truth is. He's not providing any deduction of what truth is. He's simply saying that from previous works, or at least his work, we know more or less truth is not covered by the status quo of bodies and languages. Is always an exceptional thing to bodies and languages. And for us to begin this book, we just rely on empirical evidence of the existence of these exceptions throughout history. And I'm going to follow a didactic method to show you that these actually do exist. And then he goes to actually those examples of what he means, like what are those empirical evidences. So he says the purpose of logic of worlds is to examine the theoretical trajectory of the appearance of truths in a singular world and what grounds the evidence of their existence to establish that truths not only are, they also appear. So that's a technical term we will encounter later on. There is a difference between being and appearing, which is very important to this book. I demonstrate that the appearing of truths is that of wholly singular bodies, I think it's a quotation, post-evental bodies, which compose the multiple materiality, very special formations, subjective formations are set out. Although truths exist, they come to existence by a subjective process that gives body to them. Subjects make truths to exist as being there, and once truths appear, they compose an atemporal meta-history.
Sorry, Reza, is this term present in the text, in the English text, atemporal meta-history, or is this your view of it?
This is my text.
Okay.
But I think atemporal is used by Badiou.
Okay, because I have the French version, so I'm not sure if I read this. This is interesting. Okay, thank you.
This didactic approach is no stranger to philosophy, save the critical philosophy. Badiou mentions that all philosophy since Plato, especially in his early dialogues, has tried to start from certain ideas first. Materialist dialectic demands of us such a Platonic gesture, as Badiou had outlined the Manifesto of Philosophy. The examples provided in this preface are sketches of such a gesture.
Okay, so here comes the examples, right?
Here comes the examples.
Thanks,
so
Alex.
basically it says that we are following a didactic method. We are basically deriving big ideas from very mundane, concrete things that exist in the world. And we are basing our theory based on what we observe, but a theory that can not only allow for the existence of those things that exist, also can provide a framework within which we can expand or theorize in a maximal way the trajectory of those things. Now, by the way, this is not, when he says Plato, I read this Plato as axiomatic. So what he really is doing in here is basically the interpretation of Albert Lautman thoughts around axiomatic method. One of the things that's very intriguing in this book, especially in book 1 to me, and all of the book, is basically the development of an axiomatic theory in practice. You're witnessing this development by Badiou. And a didactic method is one of the main components of such a method. So we get into the examples, section 3, mathematics example, numbers. To demonstrate the place of the truth and the position of the subject to the truth, Badiou's first example is from mathematics, and its most fundamental concept, that is numbers. The study of numbers was a popular occupation of the Greeks, and in fact, they were the ones who discovered amazing properties of numbers. Badiou remarks that despite many cultural differences in everything, including mathematics between us and the Greeks, what the Greeks touched upon was the very texture of the number, which modern arithmetic enveloped and unfolded in novel ways with employment of new symbols and techniques. In other words, the truth of numbers, as was disclosed to Greeks, remained the same throughout the time and persisted in history. So did the subjective engagement through which these truths found their bodies in the shape of mathematical proofs, which also persisted through time.
But Reza, just to intervene there, I think that this is a bit, I was very, very surprised in the way that he presents this, because I think that the way that you summarized it is a bit, can be a bit deceiving, in the sense that when you say, for example, that the truth, where is it? The truth of numbers disclosed for the Greeks remain the same, right? That gives it a sense that what is, and I think that actually goes back to the whole atemporal. Badiou rarely uses that expression, atemporal. Usually uses, and he constructs a meaning for it through the book, the idea of transtemporality, right? Being available throughout time or throughout worlds that have absolutely nothing in common is not the same as persisting, in the sense that you impose yourself. So there's a minimal difference between something remaining available and something imposing itself. And I think that he actually in this section on prime numbers, I think that he gives a good example of the difference between that, because he brings those two things. I think I'm mentioning this because you, in your reconstruction, I think you already moved past it. So this is actually something before that he mentions before, and you just summarized here in terms of many cultural differences. But he takes those differences very far. I mean, he doesn't play them down, right? He says the Greek version of this theorem that he's gonna discuss with us is there are always more prime numbers than the amount of prime numbers that you've settled upon. And the contemporary or the modern version of this is that there are an infinity of prime numbers, and that those are actually absolutely distinct statements. One of them doesn't even make sense for Greeks, right? The idea that there are infinite prime numbers makes no sense. The concept that they use to prove the multiplicity of prime numbers or the abundance of them is, none of them make sense either for us, and our concepts don't make sense for them. So I think it's useful to kind of not move too fast there, because otherwise it seems like I remember in that Prague conference, there was this historian of mathematics who made a very long case for the distinction and the historical contextualization of mathematical results in ancient Greek, and how distinct they are from modern mathematical practices. And I think that that's quite relevant, because I think Badiou takes a really long, quite a detailed care in making sure we don't assume that view, that what the Greeks did is available, like imposes itself for us kind of today, as if it objectively, only through the objective remains of their developments that lasted for us today, you get that kind of transtemporal imprint, right? They are available. Sorry.
Yeah, what I think to be important in this session, be it in the session on mathematics, the session on art, all the examples, is that he tries to push the difference as far as he can push them. Like Alex here quoted the two versions of the prime number proposition for the Greeks. For any prime, there exists some larger prime, not the post-Cantorian. The set of primes is countably infinite, which doesn't make any sense for the Greeks, right? So he tries to, he's always like he's making the case for the relativist. I take it like that, the didactic of it. He's making the case for the relativist.
Yes, exactly.
Up to a point wherein there is some invariance that warrants the availability of the idea of the transworldly idea, because he's showing all these different worlds and how they are maximally different. He's picking his examples, like the most different examples he can pick that has some invariance nevertheless. The prime numbers and the horse in the art example, and yeah, the other is not, so I don't remember now. But the idea, what seems to me that he's doing is he's almost making the case for the relativist, and then showing an invariance between these different worlds, and making then the case of these invariants to be constitutive of a transworldly truth or transworldly idea of some sort. It gets a bit messy by the end of for me it gets a bit messy by the end of the art example, when he talks about hoarseness, because then he seems to be, but this is an issue maybe just for me because I'm more committed to issues in the philosophy of language. He seems to be committed to a kind of vulgar Platonism that, you know, what justifies the use of a word is the hoarseness in this and that.
Yeah, I do think that he has a lot of pleasure in making vulgar Platonist remarks to annoy people as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt here. It's just because I think that statement without that context, I don't think that's what you meant by it. But I think the statement without that context makes it seem like what is persistent in truth is almost like an object that by itself will wander throughout history and not something. And I think that we can already start feeling, if we anticipate ourselves, why this sort of mixture of the subjective and the objective in the constitution of truth is important, because something objectively remains available, but without the contemporary engagement of modern algebra with prime ideals and whole definition of you know, that we use for cryptology and things like this, without the continuing of this process, you wouldn't see that things remained available or that they are the same in any sense, right? So were they not continued, they wouldn't be the same. That's also important, I think, which is more clear in your second statement.
Right. I just wanted to mention the word atemporal is bad use. It's on page 9.
Yeah, I think Alex found it for us here.
Right. Here it is a merely question, atemporal and meta-history. As JP mentioned, I just wanted to add one thing to this, and that is there is a level of invariance, atemporal or trans-temporal invariance for Badiou. I agree with everything that Gabriel said, but for better or for worse, for Badiou, there is an invariant that basically persists over time. And in here, I think what he's saying that the idea of prime numbers is that invariant, that although new arithmetic methods can draw a lot more out of that invariant idea, but nevertheless, the invariant idea is the same for Greeks and for us. So that invariance I think what is he referring to is that invariance.
No, I agree. I just think that while reading through the examples, it becomes clearer and clearer that what he means by invariance is not, let's say, a fixed property that repeats as a pattern in everything. It's something that, as with everything in Badiou, and again, it goes back to that example that I mentioned, where if you don't give something of yourself, the thing doesn't constitute itself as what it is.
Absolutely.
Right? It's an invariance in that way, right? It's not an invariance in the sense that it's out there. It's an invariance, again, it has to do with...
It's almost like the invariance is a form of resistance to manipulation, in a sense.
Yeah, I just mean, like, if you go to page, where is this? Page 13, he says the following: this structural reasoning, right, which concerns factorialization and certain properties that you can decompose every number into prime numbers, this structural reasoning is significant. It governed the entire development of modern algebra. Given any operational domain, you have this and that property. Regarding this process, it is clear that there is an advance, triumph, new ideas, and so on. But it is just as clear that the Greek arithmetic is immanent to this movement. So, what is made, let's say, continuous or temporarily available is not in the sense that it is the same, not in the sense that it is the same thing, right, or the same pattern, or that you necessarily use the same methods or the same ideas, or that you re-encounter the same thing. It's just that suddenly things become like you're continuing the same thing, right?
So can we say that in Badiou's parlance, the appearing of truth is always a worldly affair that depends on the parameters that requires the embedding of that truth within a world, using his parlance. But then again, the question that he's answering in this book is, if we know the truths are appearing only in worlds, so it has to follow the coordinates of bodies and languages of that world, how truths are transworldly. And that is exactly what the examples that he's showing, that the world of Greeks are different from the world of Gauss, and world of Gauss is different than the world that we have today. But there is something that basically the same truth that is basically coming to be or coming to appear in these. So the whole thing is against, I think, Badiou's argument against relativism is that although things are different in each world, as you mentioned, but there is something transworldly that comes to persist across different worlds. Obviously, that truth is not, in its appearance, is nowhere close to the appearance of this truth in Greeks, but there is an element of transworldliness to this.
Yeah, I just think, for example, on page 14, he says, what is remarkable is that the mathematical subjective type committed to the constraint is invariant. In other words, you can take up the position to which the Greek mathematical text constrains you without needing to modify the general subjective system of places of constraint. And then he gives other examples that he will explore in other fields, right? You can love a tragedy by Aeschylus because you incorporate yourself into the tragedies of Claudel, or evaluate the political import of Chinese texts from a long time ago without ceasing to be a revolutionary of the 20th century, right? So I just think it's good to complexify a bit what we kind of intuitively understand by invariant or truth remaining or remaining the same, because of course I think in the process of these examples they warrant those names of being invariant and the same, but you see that in order to be the same and in order to display some invariance, you cannot analyze it without taking into consideration what he calls the mathematical subjective type or the artistic subjective type or whatever. Especially because all examples have one thing in common, which is they are not simply a philosopher claiming that two things are similar. They are taken up as similar by the people involved in the example, right? So Picasso paints something in a way that his reference to the theme is itself inscribing into the history of painting horses. It's not comparing, you know, one thing and the other and totally imposing the reflexivity onto the example. They are all reflexive examples, right? Berlioz's example is an example that wants to play with Virgil's text. The Chinese example is an example that refers within itself to the old Chinese text. And modern mathematical algebra itself refers back to this. So that's why the subjective is immanent in a certain sense to the examples, and not simply we are saying that we're seeing these things everywhere, like some crazy transcendental, everything's connected approach, right? So I think that's relevant to qualify these words, the same, invariance, and the use of examples. But sorry, I don't think we should. I know most of this is actually covered in what comes later, so we shouldn't.
So
there's a bunch of questions by Mateus. We can address them afterwards. Just to take notes of them. Okay. Just do we continue?
In here, Badiou picks two sequences having to do with prime factorization as well as the infinity of prime numbers. Every composite, i.e. non-prime number, can be divided by a prime number. Every number is either odd or even. If even, it can be divided by 2, which is prime. If odd composite, it can be written as multiples of odd numbers only. Let P be a composite odd number, therefore P can be written as this sequence, with all the multiples also odd numbers. Every composite number can be written as a multiple of prime numbers. This can be easily shown from the previous theorem. For any x, if x is composite, there exists a prime number p that divides x, such as p1, q1. Now q1 is either a prime in case which the proof is done, or q1 is composite. So there exists a prime p2 such that q1 is equal to p2 q2. This chain will continue for all the q's till we reach a q that is prime. This chain must come to an end because x is a finite number. This will result in a chain of multiplications as follows. Such all the multiplicants are prime numbers. The third Euclid's theorem discussed is that there are infinite prime numbers. Euclid's proof is through reductio ad absurdum. Let's assume that that's not the case. Hence, there are only n prime numbers, n being finite number p1 to pn. Now let's consider the number p as follows. P is a composite number that is larger than any of the prime numbers in the list, according to the assumption. Now consider the prime number p plus 1. This number cannot be divided by any of the prime number p1 to pn, because p plus 1 is a prime number that exceeds the limit of finite prime numbers. This is absurd, meaning that our assumption that there are only finitely many prime numbers is a concept that leads to absurdity and therefore cannot be true. But if that concept isn't true, then its opposite must be true. There are infinitely many prime numbers, so the movement is as such. You establish an opposite of the concept, you reach an absurdity, which is absurdity leads to untruth of the opposite of the concept, which leads to the truth of the concept. In showing this, Badiou demonstrates two distinct ways of the subjective act in proving the first two theorems that we saw above. The subject of mathematics is constructive. In the proof of the third theorem, the subject of mathematics is faithful. What does faithful mean? It means that when the subject finds a contradiction between concept and situation, she will abandon the situation. So she opts for the concept, not the situation.
I think that's the opposite. He says at the end of page 15, it is true that we thereby presume a subject that does not want the situation to be annihilated. It will sacrifice its concept to it, right? Sacrifice the concept to the situation. So you arrive at a contradiction. You say, what do I prefer? The situation, which is the contradiction, and therefore having to accept the opposite, or will I keep the hypothesis that led to contradiction, right? So he says, the subject of truth, it holds that a concept is only valid to the extent that it supports the truth of the situation. A subject in conformity with democratic materialism may instead be nihilistic. It prefers itself to every situation. So I think in that case, it's the inverse.
Yeah, I agree. I tend to agree with Gabriel.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he's not accepting reasoning by contradiction. You have to hold to the situation in order to accept reasoning by contradiction, which is an asset of Badiou's whole approach.
So there is to choose between the maintenance of the concept and the situation. It is true that we thereby presume that a subject does not want the situation to be annihilated. It will sacrifice its concept to it. This is indeed what constitutes a subject of truth. It holds that a concept is only valid to the extent that it supports a truth of the situation. In this sense, it is a subject consistent with the materialist dialectic. A subject is in conformity with democratic materialism may instead be nihilist. It prefers itself to every situation. We shall see in book 1. Yeah, that's true. I will fix that. Thank you. As such, mathematics, far from being distant from the practice of the real life, is the one that makes real choices and is subjective analyzer of highest caliber. That's what he calls them. The fourth example is example of horses. In this second example, Badiou compares the rapustral art of 30,000 years ago from Chauvet Cave and two paintings by Picasso in 1929 and 1939. The preponderant theme of both paintings is horses. Again, like the example before, and along with the didactic aim, conducting his inquiry here, Badiou would like to show that despite the large temporal gap between the two artists, and despite the fact that Picasso was unaware of drawings at the Chauvet Cave, there still exists an invariance between the two drawings, which is again the place of truth. What is this invariance? It seems here that Badiou is invoking Plato's theory of ideas, and the invariance between the two consequences of art is the idea of hoarseness. He says, suppose that you entertain a relation of thought to animals, and that makes them into a stable components of the world under consideration. There is the horse, there is the rhinoceros, the lion. Now suppose that the empirical and vital diversity of individual living beings is subordinated to this stability. The animal is then an intelligible paradigm, and its representation is the clearest possible mark of what an idea is. This is because the animal as type or name is a clear cut in the formless continuity of the sensorial experience. It brings together flagrant organic unity with the always recognizable character of its specific form. I found this very bizarre that he's actually adopting or using this language here.
Yeah, but I think that it also, I mean, I know that I'm kind of the guy, the case for Badiou. But I think that the thing that this statement, what?
His advocate here.
Yeah, but well, somebody's got to do. I mean, I think Reza is already doing it. But for example, I think that this statement, Reza, while you were reading it, Caron was like having an epileptic fit, like because nobody can say hoarseness and go unpunished. It's not. It's too vulgar. Though I do think that it's correct, but I think that section cannot be read without taking into consideration what he makes, again, a very consistent case before, which is what he says on page 17. After he says, like, these guys didn't know each other. He didn't know, he was not directly referencing. Even if he was, he wouldn't have the same meaning at all, right? On page 17, he says, it follows that horse does not have the same meaning in the two cases. So when we say hoarseness, we're not talking about anything at the level of the problem of it doesn't correlate to the same thing in any way, right? It doesn't correspond to the same thing.
I have a problem with this example, definitely. I mean, the mathematical example, it seems to, okay, you have a discipline, you have a certain way of approaching problems, and by different approaches, you arrive at an invariant, which is defined by its resistance in the sense that it can result from independent approaches. So then I think this is very cogent. I think this is convincing. But
I disagree that that's what he says, but okay.
Hoarseness. I mean, okay, if hoarseness is not an idea, what the damn is hoarseness? I mean, it's not a. If you compare the drawing at the cave with the Picasso paintings, you can maybe defend it. Say, it's some kind of pattern, visual pattern of sorts, whatever. But it's not that either. They are totally different. You have. I mean, I'm a good manian in that sense because you have to learn to see a horse in a painting, in a sense. So, where is the hoarseness really?
Okay, let's go slowly. First, I think that this is exactly why I thought that it's important to make sure that we don't understand invariance and the same in the mathematical example in the way that we are ready to accept. And I think that this is in fact where Badiou goes much further than, for example, Meillassoux. People who like speculative realism and what I think is a very naive defense of science, like that they can give to science the privilege of saying things about archy statements, right? Because it's clear there, or at least it's supposedly clear, though it's a mostly an unfounded belief for many people, I think, the idea that because there is a clear formalism at stake, and formalism has some level of detachment from some context-based contingency or something like this, that it then would be easy to understand that it is disposable throughout, available throughout time. And I think that your definition of resistance and invariance, it's the problem. I have a problem not with what you're saying about art, but what you're saying about mathematics. And Badiou is not saying that what remained is a resistance, like a naive resistance that Greeks found when dealing with number, and we also find. It's not objective. It's something that only appears when you mix the objective with the subjective. So mix the objective with the subjective procedure through which you continue to develop algebra. If you go, so for example, that's why many very intelligent historians of mathematics go against Platonism very wisely and say, look, you can understand as a kind of archaeologist of intellectual ideas how Greeks worked. But if you go back to contemporary algebra, nobody works in that way. And we won't find the same resistances. So everything, even that is different. So what I think is like Badiou takes this kind of Meillassoux, and I think this preface has a very interesting kind of relation to the whole after finitude book and this idea of going against correlationism and saying that you can think something that's primary about situations that you're not directly involved in, or worlds that you're not available.
I think he's doing for perspectivism what Meillassoux was trying to do with correlationism in a sense.
Yeah, but he's doing also something to Meillassoux. Why? Because he's not claiming, this is why I insisted on this, that anything objective by itself about results in Greek mathematics remains for us, unless you're engaged with contemporary mathematics, in which case, then you are working on the same thing. It's a weird statement, but I think it's important because then you can see the homogeneity with the other statement. Like, there's nothing objectively the same in the Haiti Revolution and Rosa Luxemburg's socialist movement in Germany. Everything is different, and if you try to apply the same method or say that you will find the same resistances, that is not true. The only moment in which the same appears is when you're trying to do something totally different. You're in Germany trying to organize an advanced capitalist society. You will be able to look back and say, shit, those guys were dealing, like, my problem is that problem. So it's the problem, but you see the problem, the same problem doesn't even exist if you're not inside the procedure. You see my point? Like, it's not an extrinsic view of similarities and patterns and things like this. It's an intrinsic view in the sense that
I think there's not a problem there. I think if you're engaged in the same problems, of course you are engaged in the same problems. There's some kind of persistence, and there is some kind of persistence throughout the history of humanity. You know, this is non-problematic actually. But I think he's saying more than that. He's saying that there are some stuff you find within the procedures that are invariant and transworldly.
Okay, but the stuff of procedures, that's the point. What is the stuff of procedures? I'm just trying to avoid something which I think is a very scientism sort of ideology, where there is something that is just there in mathematics or physics or whatever, that makes for it objectively transtemporal. You don't need to do anything about it. It's simply accessible from anywhere. And the whole point, I think, is to show that there are positions and other positions, and they're distinct in the sense that certain engagements make the continuity consistent where other engagements don't, right? If you wait to see if something is transtemporal to engage with it, you won't make it consist as transtemporal. And I think that this is relevant. Why is this relevant? Because it includes a reflexivity inside the process that I think makes clear what he's proposing in the artistic example. He's not saying hoarseness concerns a referent of horse, and they're both.
Yes, Matheus is quoting it from page 19 here. I think this makes it more clear. Far from being the descent of the idea into the sensible, it is the sensible creation of the idea. That seems to be the main connection to a material account of hoarseness, idea of horse, I guess.
Yeah, what I think that you need to combine that quote with the end of page 19, where he says, in painting, the animal is the occasion to signal, through the certainty of the separating line alone of the drawing, that between the idea and existence, between the type and the case, I can create and therefore think the point that remains indiscernible. So people who engage in the continuity of drawing horses, even though what they draw is totally distinct, the meaning of their drawing is totally distinct, the horses existed at one point, they don't exist in the other, for example, totally different. If they repeat like Pierre Menard, they won't be doing the same thing. Nothing objectively is the same. But the fact that you're exploring the tension between the type and the case makes you, includes you in the continuity. And that's what's hoarseness, and not simply a horse or the horse.
You are making this acceptable, but by the same token, you are making it less Platonist for me.
Man, I'm sorry, but if you give any proof of anything being transtemporal at the level of beyond bodies and languages, I'm happy to call you a Platonist. You know, like it's just, that's the problem with his Platonism. It doesn't come where you want it to come, which is it never applies the theory of participation to objects.
Yeah, because when he says hoarseness, it seems like he's guaranteeing a reference to any, you know, utterances or drawings or whatever, horse pictures and everything by this property. There is a property of hoarseness, and property are non-spatial temporal. And then because he's talking about, you know, trans-worldly truths, trans-temporal ideas, it has this flavor of something non-spatial temporal in the sense of, you know, Platonism in analytic philosophy, which I think is a trick. For me, it's just a trick, nothing else. I mean, to say that horse is a horse because of hoarseness, I mean, okay, it's a circular definition.
Yeah, but Rafael is pointing here that even your definition of vulgar Platonism, it needs updating, because even in Plato himself, hoarseness as this sort of ideal type was itself questioned, like his theory of ideas.
But I got
just
out.
Selected the one quote in the chat that would help me.
I got out of my way to say analytic philosophy's version of Platonism, the vulgar analytic philosophy version of Platonism. I'm not talking about Plato himself, right? So in this sense, Platonism for me being brought up as an analytic philosophy of sorts, Platonism is this cluster of ideas that appeals.
Sure. Yeah, I don't want to get too much into this, but the reason why I'm insisting on this is, again, this is supposed to be a didactic exercise, and even though Badiou thinks he's a great didactician, I think that he's good for French people, and for me, it's hard sometimes to give so much to him as if it was as clear as he thinks it is. But I do think that he gives enough. If you consider the 4 examples together, like, and I think that this is very useful for understanding his position. Don't take an example in one procedure and then go to the next. Like, when you get something new from a different procedure, go back to the previous one and see where the similarity is. And what I think he's doing, he's enriching our understanding of what formalism means, right? From the artistic example, you see that what is repeating throughout time is the distinction between type and case. Of course, none of the two things are transtemporal, but that there is always a gap that you can explore and do different horses forever. That's transtemporal, right? It's neither the language, hoarseness as a sort of set of properties, nor the body, actual horses. Those two things disappear in time. They're definitely world-based. But that there is a gap between the two, and that you can extract different forms of horse, that's the idea, right? The idea is not, I know what a horse is. It's this. That's an ideal. An idea is, I have an idea, I'm gonna paint this fucking horse, and it comes out like you don't even know what it is. And the funny thing is that this is the same for mathematics. That's why I had a problem with your interpretation in the case of mathematics. It's not that the language remained, nor that the body remained. What remained is that using reduction ad absurdum, using certain ways of decomposition of numbers into primes, you can continue to explore the gap that we moderns call infinity and so on, right? So I think that this is, I wish he would be a bit clearer, but that's the only consistent way of reading this that I can think of. Otherwise, I agree totally with you. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear, but
I think we won't solve this dispute right now. It's impossible. We should go on, and I would like afterwards to hear what our friends are saying here. I mean, to open their mics at some point, because they're saying lots of interesting stuff as well. But so should we maybe go on? What do you think?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry, Reza, for monopolizing it. It's just that I know Caron would die right now if we didn't help out.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. I tend to think in this case that Badiou, it's very hard to defend what Badiou is saying, black and white, right? I mean, he's basically referring to idea of hoarseness. And the other thing that I wanted to mention that it's important for us to consider is, for Badiou, truth is a multiplicity itself, and it's a durable multiplicity. So when it appears in the world, there is a sense in which you change the world using that multiplicity, you create what he calls in being an event, a generic extension. And that generic extension actually is different than the ground model. The situation changes when truth occurs, and there is a way in which by participation of subject. So truth is not really for Badiou an ephemeral thing. It's not something that is very complex or abstract, or is a very concrete thing that is a multiplicity itself. Is probably in language that this book uses, is something that is made of languages and bodies in the world. It's just an exception to that. So I wanted to take that into consideration when we are talking. You're making truth too abstract. It is not that. It's not too abstract for. It's not abstract at all for Badiou. Yeah. The drawing of art on the walls of the cave, opposite to the role that shadows had in Plato's allegory, stand for coming out from the cave. Far from being the descent of the idea into the sensible, it is the sensible creation of the idea. The drawing avers the horse as what exists eternally for thought. The main contemplation, Badiou also calls it the raw intuition in the form of drawing. In the form of drawing, which is achieved by a cut made by the separating line, or what Badiou calls dominating contour, manifests the same idea in both artifacts. In that respect, the hunter and the modern millionaire are both subjects to the same truth. They have given body to the same immortal truth that we call the idea of hoarseness. So the political example, the state revolutionary equality and terror, the example is provided here is from two temporal sequences in China, the great debate between legalists who are progressive and Confucians who are conservative in 81 BC, and Mao's critique of Stalin of the 30s to the 50s at the threshold of 60s. Badiou captures the essence of these political debates as follows: a traversal public truth that may be designated as follows: a truly political administration of the state subordinates all economic laws to voluntary representations, fights for equality, and combines, where the people are concerned, confidence and terror. This immanent articulation of will, equality, confidence, and terror can be read in the proposals of the legalists and of Mao. It is rejected in the proposals of the Confucians and of Stalin, which inscribe inequality into the objective laws of becoming. Using Badiou's other formulation of this matrix in his theory of the subject, this could also be articulated within the general framework of subjectivization, which is will and confidence, and subjective process of equality and terror. The constituents, that constitutes the two main operations within the idea of revolutionary politics, and also the subordination of the state to this idea. The central question within this politics are under what conditions or decisions a figure of a political subject can emerge, which is the question of subjectivization through the determinations according to will and confidence, and under what conditions or decisions the figure can be maintained, subjective process under the determinations of equality and terror. Badiou captures these central questions in the following way. But in a more essential sense, one can see in this entire immense temporal arc that thought confronted with the state's logic of decision must argue on the basis of the consequences, and that in so doing, it delineates a subjective figure that detaches itself from the conservative figure. The central issue, as Badiou captures within both historical sequences, is the emergence and maintenance of the political subject. How is the question of emergence of the subject or subjectivization addressed in relation to the two determinations of will and confidence. In the first political sequence, this question is addressed around the choice between following the established mode of production, a conservative choice under determination of will with no confidence, or allowing a new mode spurred by commerce, a progressive choice under the determination of will with confidence. In the second sequence, this question is addressed around the choice between the Stalinist distrust of the great mass of the people who are still peasants, manifested in Stalin's emphasis on knowledge of the law and valuing only technology and the cads, conservative will without confidence, versus what Mao proclaims, which is confidence placed in the peasants and distrust for the cads and their children, a progressive will with confidence. As Badiou indicates, in both situations, what is central is the matter of subjective activism or subjectivization. Regarding the second set of determinations, which support subjective process, i.e. equality and terror, Badiou also relies on the same two examples. In the first sequence, it is a choice between morality and leniency of the law, a conservative choice with equality under weak authority, or formidability and absolute authority of the law, a progressive choice with equality under strong authority. This opposition is still at work in Mao's reaction to the Manual of Political Economy, published in Soviets under Khrushchev, by saying that the role of the state as a machine is to oppress hostile forces. As Badiou indicates in this regard, without terror or authority, the natural movement of things lies in the dissidence of the power of the rich. In fact, it is only through the absolute authoritarianism that a principled egalitarianism can be brought about. An instance of politics is a temporalization of consequences of the operations of subjectivization and subjective processes. That is, it is the consequence of conditions according to which a political subject emerges and is maintained. As the result, an instance of a politics is a knotting together of all four determinations of will, equality, confidence, and terror. Badiou summarizes this point in four remarks. One, in both sequences, the determinations, the truth regarding the emergence and maintenance of the political subject are perceived to be under the following four determinations: will against socio-economic necessity, equality against the established hierarchies of power or wealth, confidence against anti-popular suspicion of the fear of the masses, authority against the natural free play of competition. Number two, the four determinations are knotted, measured up according to the consequences of their inscription in an effective world. A politics is always made or knotted according to the consequences of the decision according to these determinations. Number three, there exists a subjective form adequate to the different instances of the generic kernel of truth. For example, state revolutionary like Mao, masses rebel like Spartacus. And number four is the subjective form must be carried in a historically determined world. This is the question of a political body, for example, Leninist Party, Red Army, etc.
Now you have a note on Lazarus.
Yes. You want me to read that note, or do you want to talk before we go to Lazarus?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I wanted to mention is that one thing that I think it's clearer here, and I think the reason is that Badiou has a much longer project of trying to present the sort of reflexive character of Maoism as something which is the development of a Marxist or communist program plus a certain reevaluation of its own history, right? So it's easier for him to call Mao, as he does on page 25, a good revolutionary formalist, in the sense that there is something being developed that is not yet completed, and there is some revision needed, and this revision happened, like this revision in the sense of continuation of its creative deployment requires what he calls terror, right? But I think it's interesting to locate terror, which is something that he connects with this sort of forceful deployment of equality, right? But you rarely mentions the state because of his own political convictions as something that has a positive function. He notes, and I think that's what brings him to Lazarus in the end notes, right? That there is, for readers, there might be a contradiction in the way that he presents the choice for the state and for state revolutionaries. There is a contradiction between that and his own political stance. So he says people might be thinking that there is a weird thing here, and that's what I think that drives him there, is that in that situation the state is functioning as something that enforces an equality that is formal. It's not natural in the sense of if you just leave the situation be, things will move that way, right? And I think that that's a nice, the fact that terror is the name that he gives to the affect or whatever that comes along with following a formalism where it detaches itself from the natural development of things is interesting also for other procedures. There's definitely a terror involved in mathematics, you know. And I think that if you follow Caron's musical experiments, you can definitely hear it there as well. So I think it's a nice recuperation of it, that is not so overdetermined by the meaning of terror, for example, in French Revolution, you know.
Yeah, but terror there. I mean, of course you're making a joke, but
kind of.
Yeah, kind of. Terror there is not really a phenomenological notion, right? Just the fact that you are binding the, you know, the way things are in a sense. And this is also true of, you know, aesthetic procedures. For instance, 20th century music and all of that. You are kind of binding what was second nature in a sense, in order to follow some kind of formalism that will produce certain effects that wouldn't be produced without them, without the formalism. So it seems to me that terror is not necessarily, I mean, you were talking about music, I mean, you're referring to noise and all that, but in a sense, I think. But terror is also this, the binding of the natural, in a sense, right? In a sense that makes it possible to continue otherwise.
Yes, I think I just think it's nice to point that out, because first the example goes, if you just consider it politically, it goes against examples Badiou uses regularly, which is usually praising non-state politics, non-state, the questioning the party state. So in this example, it's something else. But also I think it's useful. I mean, I've seen other people argue for this, and I think it's correct, that if you were to write a history of, for example, the history of communist thinking, you would have to include liberalism as it first emerged. It was breaking with the situation, opening up to a certain level of, similar to what the conservative progressive debate happens here in China in the salt and iron discourse thing. So it's nice, and I think that the Lazarus reference that he makes in this section is useful in that sense, because Lazarus is very good to show this sort of political languages that are born in a situation. They're useful to push this formalism to a point, then they get saturated, and there's definitely a use here of the state that I think is historically determined in that sense. Somebody said that they, sorry, yeah?
Nothing, I thought that you finished.
Sure, yeah.
So a note on Lazarus, Badiou spends a few pages in the appendix to speak about the relation of his theory of universal truth in relation to Lazarus' conception of politics as a thinking that exists as a discontinuous modal interiority. So that is the theory of Lazarus. To Lazarus, politics is a thinking that is disjoint with any other thinking, such as scientific and political thinking. Politics is an objectless thinking, and therefore objects such as party, state, or classes do not belong to politics. The two axioms of politics are people think, and thought is a relationship of the real, intend to carve out a space for politics as pure immanence, designating a space of subjectivization with no object. When Lazarus says that politics is an interiority, in a nutshell, he means that politics has its own field of thought, proper to it, and identifiably separate from other fields such as philosophy, economics, history and sociology, etc. This difference is established not only by the way in which politics sets up its own boundary from its outside, but also from the way in which its internal operations follow a grammar that is different from that of the sciences, for example. Lazarus says politics is modal. It means that political thinking only is only identifiable by the thoughts that have been opened up in the world in a specific space and time. Thoughts create categories, notions, and concepts that are only applicable to the space and time of the mode, not outside of it. When the mode ceases, the categories of the mode become saturated. The modal character of politics' existence makes it singular, since politics only exists as a mode, and since each mode is specific and unique, then each instance of politics is singular. Given this conception of politics, as Badiou remarks, the idea that there exists subjective invariance, constituted here by the conjunction of four predicates, equality, confidence, will, and terror, seems directly to contradict the nominalist dichotomy of modes. It seems to me that Badiou is offering two justifications that this in fact is not the case. One is a structural justification and the other one is logical or perhaps phenomenological. In brief, the structural justification states that the relation of politics to philosophy is not the relation of part to whole. Philosophy does not subsume politics. He has made this abundantly clear in his previous works, and in particular in Manifesto for Philosophy. Badiou calls philosophy the space for compossibility of all four generic conditions. It is where these generic procedures together form a philosophical vision compatible with each particular condition. As a result, to Badiou, there is not only no contradiction between philosophy and politics, there is also no competition between the two. They fall under different domains of concern. The logical or phenomenological reasoning goes to the essence of Badiou's project in Logic of Words. The project of Logic of Words, in brief, is to show how truths that in their appearance are always singular, specific to a world, their bodies are made from the elements of a specific world, very much adaptable to the conception of Lazarus of politics, political thinking, or at the same time eternal and universal. In the materialist dialectic, what secures the eternity of truths is precisely the fact that they result from a singular process in a world disjoint from each other, from every other. It's only today that philosophy can think a combination of singular and universal together.
Yeah, I think that this is actually, I mean, in every example, I think there are kind of temptations to avoid. I think in the mathematical example, the temptation concerns, let's say, the spontaneous tendency of certain philosophers to accept, let's say, vulgar alternity to mathematics. And I don't think that that's what Badiou is proposing, because if mathematics is to fall under his theory of worlds, it must be singular and must be everything, all its objective stuff is dependent on the world in which it is developed. So at that level, I think the first example, the temptation, is this sort of easy acceptance of transtemporality, where he is shifting a bit the position of what is truly eternally available, right? In the art example, I think that we explored it a bit, but I think that what makes it hard to follow that example is that hoarseness and the relation between representation and situation is usually is thought as a binary, so that the idea that something persists, it seems like it's one of the two. So it seems like he's talking about a property that remains in time.
It's like you have an extrinsic property that is being referred to by the
Exactly.
artistic procedure.
Exactly. I think that in that case, it's nice to see that the problem is, first he introduces, I think, a third term, which is when you go to, within the artistic practice of drawing, you have a duality between the case of the drawing, not the case of the horse, and the history of drawing horses. That's the type and the case. And that's the in-between that you explore, right? That's crucial. And that's what makes it formalism and not a problem of description in a naive sense. And in this example, I think that the problem, which is a problem that I think everyone involved in politics and Marxism, communism knows all too well, which is that we love to think that what Lenin did applies today, what Mao did applies today. And so there is a temptation to think that something of this modes of doing politics and concepts like working class and things like this, they would be transtemporal in some sense. And I think that in this example, it becomes clear and Mateus was telling me that he thought it was the clearest of the 4 examples. I think it's also a temptation there, because it's not the point that what was the right kind of path to take in China 81 BC is the same path to take in China in the 60s. Of course, it's not nothing is the same. The place of commerce, the place of what is a subjective displacement, what is equality, all those things are different, right? The very meaning of equality changed. In the introduction of commerce, the right to do commerce might be the spreading of equality in some sense, but the very right to do commerce underlies the commerce of labor, which is the basis of inequality in modern society. So no referent remains stable, right, in that sense. So it's hard to, I think that, again, the usefulness of the example, which I think is singular to politics, goes back to the problem, and not so much to, in this sense, I think Deleuze is very useful, like to connect always ideas to problems rather than ideas to, let's say, established patterns, right? Nothing in the patterns remain, nothing in the methods remain, but if you engage in politics today, you will suddenly gain some solidarity with the problems of Chinese guys trying to organize things in 81 BC. And why? That's the issue, right? Why is it that suddenly you say, fuck those, it's rough, man, I know it's rough, trying to get guys to take confidence that some imminent process that is happening with the peasants or with the peripheries of Rio or whatever can be trusted as the basis for a different form, right? But nothing, neither the form, nor the subject, nor the social, nothing is the same, nor even the way that this trust appears. So I think we have the temptation also to accept the transtemporality of this in some sense, but it's as deceiving perhaps as the mathematical one, because I think that Badiou wants to no wonder that he selected Lazarus, who's his a friend and comrade after all, to intervene in this debate, because Lazarus has this radical view of politics as discontinuous, right? To the point that he, and Badiou defends this view, reject the category of history as there being any objective continuation or necessary objective loss to social structure, right? So it's both easy to understand, but I think sometimes what makes it easier to follow this example is also something that makes it seductive but just to briefly mention something Alex mentioned more than once, the problem of synonymy. But I think that, synonymy is not the only way that two things operate on the same. Synonymy is to me is a word that's too connected to a language kind of approach to things, and that it implies that something is the same at the level of meaning, right? And you can have equivalences that are not at the level of meaning, I think. And I think this is important, and the way that in every example, the idea that a subjective process continues. you are engaged in the same subjective process. I think the fact that he returns to this many times, yeah, perhaps this, yeah, but again, it's funny, right? Because a problematic synonym, or you're stuck in the same problem. The word "same" there means something very, very subtle, right? So it's, I wouldn't know how to argue for it, but I think that equivalence doesn't necessarily mean equivalence in meaning, reference, or language. That's the complicated thing, right? With the whole structure of the book in our hands, like with a greater logic in view, it's easier to argue that things are partaking of the same without being referred by the same words, referring to the same objects, because we have a richer framework to still claim that things are invariant, even though languages and bodies are not invariant, right? But I think synonymy tends to be not to help us to refine in that direction, perhaps a bit. It might make it a bit deceiving. But again, sorry to spend so long time, but I think that at the level, we're at the third example, and I think that at this point it already starts accumulating this kind of shift of focus that never falls into languages and never falls into bodies. Those are singular, defined by world. Everything that the stuff which appears is not the same in any sense, not even the, let's say, linguistic connections, let's say how you organize bodies. You shouldn't organize always the same throughout history to make politics. That's a very bad idea. So even if it doesn't, even if we don't have clarity of what is the same, I think it's already enough from this preface if we get the feeling at the end of it that, okay, but you made the case against the transtemporality of bodies, against the transtemporality of languages, and he's still claiming that something is invariant. So what the fuck is it? Like, that's a good question to have at the beginning of the book, you know, because he definitely didn't give us enough material to answer it.
Actually, to that point, even to some sense, to earlier sense that you said, against the transtemporality of the instances of truth.
Mm-hmm. True, yeah.
So section 6 is amorous example from Virgil to Berlioz. The amorous example from Virgil's Aeneid and Berlioz's Trojans, in which the two artists have both aptly recognized and produced artistic manifestations of the sheer excess of the two that love makes out of banal and anonymous individual ones. In Aeneid, the excess embraces both divine as well as cosmical infinities. In Berlioz, this excess is translated into the exceptional symphony fragments that itself presaged the 20th century jazz orchestra. What is common in these two seemingly disjoint forms of representation, poetry of antiquity and 19th century opera, is the truth of love that turns a body, a banal individuality, and creates an exceptional infinity of existence.
Yeah, I think that this example is by far the most problematic one. I think that here on the chat window, people are making this remark that, okay, I said the synonymy is not necessarily a good way for us to approach what remains the same. Rafael proposed participation, even though we don't know exactly what participation means. But I think that this is a great, this debate is a really good kind of thermometer for the reading of the book, right? Can we, by the end of this reading, make a distinction, a conceptual distinction between synonymy and participation? I think that's, if we can make that consistent distinction, we got a lot from the book, because that's pretty much what the book is about.
That's a litmus test for the reading of the book.
Yes, it's a really good test. And I think that Rafael, in my opinion, is totally right. That the thing is, if you just go into it, I think that this is relevant. Of course, synonymy is a subject-object dynamic, right? Because no one is stupid to think that when you use the word, the meanings are not dependent on the practices, therefore also not simply something about words and objects. But the way that Badiou shifts the theory of participation from how we are used to read it in Plato, meaning it concerns chair and chairness, chair and the idea of chair, to show that it really works and it really makes much more sense. And participation is, let's say, read through Rousseau, where participation means also engaging in the general will, means investing subjectively into something. That combination of Plato and Rousseau, which is no wonder Rousseau is the guy he debates with right when he's introducing fidelity and generic in Being an Event. But I think that this is this displacement where participation makes more sense when creative thinking and development in construction of something is connected with the object's relation to the idea. When you don't decouple these two things into simply a relation between idea and objects and types and cases, right? It makes clear what the project is, after all. But just to mention here, I think that this example of the love procedure is the worst by far, and for three reasons: a good reason, a bad reason, and a reason I don't know how to categorize. The first is that Badiou says everywhere that many books, and Being an Event, he does this all the time. He says love and then comma if it exists, closes comma, because or parentheses, because the very nature of the procedure for him, which concerns intimacy, concerns the construction of something, which concerns the people involved in a very kind of invisible way, right, makes it so that it's very hard to kind of have a resource of examples of love that are not mediated by other procedures. So most of the examples
have a library of love or something.
Exactly, which is a good question if this is a necessary thing or a contingent thing. And I think that this is one of the reasons that connects to the second problem, which is that it's very hard sometimes to distinguish the literary development or the artistic procedure that Badiou always mentions when he mentions love from the love procedure. But this is actually good because it gives us, let's say, instances where you can see how the simultaneous treatment of two procedures can be accomplished, because this is a problem. Badiou seems to be a guy that divides things into kind of boxes. There are different procedures, but clearly these things in reality are mixed in many ways. Of course, there is a definition of the procedure, like Alex just mentioned here, something concerning the lack of sexual relation and blah, 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 blah. But at the same time, when he gives an example, it's not an example from psychoanalysis or somebody's case study of Dora from Freud or anything like this, because again, he has problems with psychoanalysis. It's not like psychoanalysis is a generic procedure in the full sense. So he gets stuck between psychoanalysis and art most of the time. Psychoanalysis for the concepts, because that's where the public conceptualization of love in a consistent way has happened, and art for the case studies, because that's where the publicization of intimacy with a form has mostly happened. So you're stuck in two other kind of grammars. And it's a nice thing that we need to work through this mess, because it's not, Badiou is such a kind of schematic guy that rarely we have a chance to think through the problem of these things being superimposed. So I think that's a good thing. It's interesting to think about it, to think about these questions. But on the other hand, there is for me a problem in this example that I think is the way that his commitment to the concept that psychoanalysis develops, but in this non-clinical way and with sometimes almost in a metaphorical sense. I think that gets in the way, like in the first paragraph of this Ambrose example, where he wants to show, look, everyone, there are many pieces like this guy, Denis de Rougemont, who argue that love is a medieval invention, Western medieval invention. You don't find it everywhere. And then Badiou's defense that this is universal is very bad. I mean, it wouldn't pass any feminist test. It wouldn't pass what we discussed today concerning the plasticity of sexuality and things like this, even though he tries to put sexuality out of the picture by saying it's an ordinary affair. It's not really our concern. It will just be the constraints of a given world, and then we work from it. I don't think that the example itself uses well that space. It ends up, the way that he defends it is very much based on this kind of outdated jargon. And I'm a psychoanalyst, but I would be the first to accept outdated jargon of psychoanalysis itself, of having a hard time thinking sexual difference without having to mention men and women, as if, even though the examples that he gives, like he ends with the example of Death in Venice, still, which is not, wouldn't fit this depiction, still he flirts with it in a way that's totally useless. I think it doesn't help conceptually in any way. On the contrary, just tends to kind of tone down what's really useful about his construction, I think. And it's also very confusing for me in this example, the way that he selects passages from Virgil to exemplify something that is not Virgil's writing, even though his own concept of literature and art is very much disconnected from reference in reality. So I think that already shows what happens when you try to change perspective and think about, let's say, the idea of love and not the idea of poetry, right? Suddenly you're no longer looking at a formalism for its own interiority and its immanence. You're looking at it very vulgarly as a report on somebody's love encounter. And yeah, exactly. So I think that part of the reason why the reading is terrible, it makes it clear if you take that shift in perspective into consideration. And but again, the fact that you need to take that shift of perspective into consideration it's explained by what we said before, that the perspective or the subjective position and the object and the consistency of the procedure itself, they're connected. So the moment that you are engaged, let's say, with politics, and you're listening to The International by Potier, you're no longer concerned. I mean, even if you are concerned with musical elements, the things that stand out, for example, if I were worried about it, would be, will people think I'm being pedantic by playing the song? Will they connect to its history? Will it sound pretentious? Those are not musical questions itself, like how to compose, which tonality, which structure, and so on. So there is kind of a emptying out of a deactivation of questions that are concerned the interiority of the musical procedure, because now you're concerned with questions that are active politically, right? The same thing I think happens here with Virgil. Like the way that he selects and treats the material is totally devoid of any subtlety of literary analysis that you could find perhaps in other texts where literature was at stake. So I think it's interesting to see that there is kind of an exercise that he ends up having to do in order to make that shift. But I find it remarkably bad as an example. And that even though there are passages that I consider interesting, I don't think it's for nothing that Rez ended up summarizing it into one paragraph almost, because it's very hard to separate what's useful in terms of material that concerns a process of love and material that concerns simply quotes from Virgil and things like this, right? We could go back to this somewhere else, but I do think that this is very, very poor in material to clarify things, really.
Should we move on?
Sure.
So 7 is distinctive features of truth, persuasive features of freedom. Going through these anecdotal instances, the point is to recognize that there are cross-worldly invariants that, despite having each instance of which belonging to a given individual world, they remain nevertheless universal and eternal or cross-worldly. Badiou calls these invariants truths. A truth is part of a world. Its body is constituted by the elements of a world. Nonetheless, it exhibits a type of universality that those elements drawn from the worldly particularity cannot sustain on their own. Badiou summarizes in 7 points the distinctive features of truths. A truth is eternal despite being produced in a measurable or counted empirical time. A truth is translinguistic. It is separable from every specific language despite being inscribed in a particular language. A truth always presupposes the material traces of an event. These traces do not pertain to any empirical uses or utilities within the world, but they affect at least one object of this world. A subject is an operative figure linked to the traces of an event. A subject is an operative disposition of the traces of the event and what they deploy in the world. A truth articulates and evaluates the components on the basis of consequences and not of mere givenness. A truth starting from the articulation of consequences elicits subject forms which are linked instances of an invariant matrix of articulation. A truth is both infinite and generic. It is a radical exception. It is an elevation of anonymous existence of the idea. Given what has been said, one crucial difference between democratic materialism and materialist dialectic can be captured as follows. Democratic materialism promotes the correlation of life and individual. Material dialectics advocates the correlation of truth and subject. This difference grounds the difference in the definition of freedom and life to the respective ideologies. With respect to freedom, in the democratic materialism, freedom is defined in a negative way. No language forbids individual bodies from deploying their own capacities. This definition of freedom explains why in democratic materialism, sexual freedom is the paradigm of every freedom. The other freedoms will necessarily follow from the non-interdiction of the uses that an individual may make in private of the body that inscribes him or her in the world. In the materialist dialectic freedom, freedom is defined in a positive way, participation of bodies through languages in the exception of the truth. Being free does not pertain to the register of relation between bodies and languages, but directly to that of incorporation to a truth. This means that freedom presupposes that a new body appears in the world. As a sequence in materialist dialectic, sexuality is no longer the paradigm of freedom without becoming a counter paradigm, either as in certain religious moralities. Instead, the paradigm of truth becomes the four conditions of truth. Then I have a footnote. It's important to also note that for Zizek, following Lacan, the sexual difference or sexual relationship does not exist, is the paradigm for the fundamental thesis that the real and not just the big other is not all. For Zizek, Kantian antinomies are not epistemological but ontological. And following Kopchak, he believes that these antinomies are reflected in Lacan's formula of sexuation. In this regard, sex for Zizek is the paradigm for the failed absolute.
Yeah, I think that requires some remarks though, because definitely Zizek would side with Badiou here, right? So sexuality and sex are totally distinct things for psychoanalysis. You could say sexuality has to do with connection between languages and bodies, and sex has to do with, it's a totally formal category, right? It has absolutely no empirical correlate in the sense of it doesn't concern either biology nor sexual practices. That's why you get that funny saying that for Freud, everything is sexual except the sexual act, right? Like the way you describe yourself, everything that concerns the gap between representation and presentation, right? Concerns sexuality, but representation of sex and its presentation as a sexual thing, neither of them are really sexual. So I think that's a very complicated thing. If you guys want, we could go into it, but I think it's, it wouldn't side, Zizek against him there.
You wouldn't?
No, not against him. No, not at all.
Okay, so probably we need to talk about that then. Life, the category of life is the other category that is important to both dialectic materialism and materialistic dialectic. And the difference between their definitions can help us to measure the difference between the two ideologies. For dialectic materialism, the category of life is a
democratic, right?
So yeah, in the democratic materialism, the category of life is a major signifier which designates every empirical correlation between body and languages. The success in life is today the only imperative that everyone understands. It is therefore quite natural that the study of the norms of life is central to what democratic materialism calls knowledge or even philosophy, which is always a blend of genealogy of symbolic forms and virtual or desiring theory of bodies. This blend, which may also be called linguistic anthropology, and is systematized by Foucault, serves as the practical regime of knowledges under democratic materialism. We saw earlier that Badiou believes Deleuze was one of the figures that in 20th century tried to counter the regime of democratic materialism by positing the infinite power of thought in an effort to uphold the chances of metaphysics against contemporary sophistry. But this materialism did not cut deep enough in the body of the established ideology, for example, in relation to the category of life, which is also a central category of Deleuze. He came to tolerate the fact that most of his concepts were sucked up, so to speak, by the doxa of body, desire, effect, networks, the multitude, nomadism, and enjoyment into which a whole contemporary politics sinks as if into a poor man's Spinozism. What about materialistic dialectic? The category of life is also important to materialist dialectic. This category is defined in materialist dialectic in relation to the question, what is to live, and finds the answer as its preliminary definition. To live is to participate point by point in the organization of a new body in which a faithful subjective formalism comes to take root.
Yeah, on this here, sorry, yeah, Karan.
So I would suggest just a question of organization. Maybe we should end the reading here for today, perhaps, and pick it up next week. And
sure,
maybe
otherwise it'll be too long. Yeah.
Open up just a little bit of debate before ending. What do you guys think? Because it's just one topic, the 8th, which is also like a preview, announcing what is to come, and perhaps to begin this next week it won't be a problem. It will be good.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe to have a debate now, a little bit, at least debate with everybody might be interesting for the next, say, 20 minutes to half an hour. I don't know.
Sure. No, I agree with leaving the last section to begin as at the beginning of next meeting, because I agree with you. It's very kind of an attempt to be an general introduction to the book, right?
It will touch upon things of being an event. It will need some clarifications and some discussions there. It will be, yeah, it is a good introduction, but it's kind of tricky to give it. I think give this topic at the ending of a meeting like today. Don't know what you think.
Sure. So I don't know if Dennis and Reza.
Yeah,
I had something.
Asked you yesterday. This is a good introduction, but it's kind of heavy concept-wise as well.
Yeah,
so.
I agree.
What do you think?
Yeah, well, no, I really like this. It was very illuminating, actually, the discussion around it. I always thought the preface was a bit like the polemical style of it really got in the way of understanding, especially because he seems to start off attacking this thing, democratic materialism, which doesn't really seem like that important for the rest of the book. And I think the discussion earlier about how it's not so much democratic materialism as an enemy, so much as we're trying to find some kind of supplement to it, something we can add to democratic materialism to maximize our thought, right? But I was recently reading Transcritique again by Cartani, and I think that really the echoes of that make this section a lot clearer, namely this notion of the interstice, right? I think Badiou's universality is not one that exists independent of worlds, but it's in the gap between worlds. And that's where truth lies. Truth as an exception means that there is a gap that we can think between worlds that has some content of its own. This gap, I mean, the way that Cartani describes it or develops it in Transcritique is he talks about, for example, Descartes and the awareness of like different customs being the different systems between different cultures led to Cartesian doubt, which is the origin of the subject, right? The I think, therefore I am is also like I doubt, therefore I am. But what is it that I doubt? I doubt that my system of rules is absolute because I've encountered a different system, and I cannot really, favor my system over this other one, right? So I think the same thing happens with worlds. This idea, if you encounter a painting of a horse in a cave, this hoarseness is not so much a positive property, like everyone was already pointing out, right? It's very problematic to consider some kind of atemporal property of hoarseness, but rather it's the encounter with a different system that leads to the question of what is the nature of this difference, because it's not simply completely foreign. There is something invariant, like we've been saying. But anyway, this idea of the interstice between worlds, it has very strong echoes of the move from set theory to category theory in mathematics, right? Because in set theory, sets are different purely by extension, because there are, let's say, some elements that exist in one set that don't exist in the other. But in category theory, it is the transformation between one object to another that, or the set of transformations, actually, it can be a class technically, because it can have more than a set of number of transformations. But let's say, the quality of transformations between one object and another, that's what is this, I would say, the central object of study is in category theory. So I think we're moving in that direction as well. So yeah, these are just some thoughts I had while we were exploring this idea of truth, because first of all, it's materialist, because he's trying to capture this in a positive sense, which is not simply as a property, right? Truth has to be something somehow invariant between the worlds. It must have some, let's say, bodily or real existence. It can't simply be, an abstraction. But nevertheless, it can't really fit into the definition of bodies and languages, which actually he doesn't really, at least from this description, he hasn't really given a definition of body or languages yet. So yeah. I think that's another problem.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, man. That this is one of the problems I have with the preface, which is he uses a language that he never returns to in the whole book. Like, only in the conclusion, he mentions the idea of bodies versus languages. The concept of body that he will construct, totally distinct from what he's supposedly criticizing here. So it's hard to know what is this in exception to, right? He trusts that our natural or intuitive understanding of languages and bodies enough to give a glimpse of what he's talking about, but it's not really, these terms are not going to be like crucial concepts, right?
Yeah.
But sorry, yeah, Reza.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that I totally agree with your connection. I really think, especially in your project specifically, that I know concerns, let's say, very Karatani like concern, which is how to deal with capitalism and political economy and things like this, that Karatani is more clearly concerned with. It's interesting that both in Karatani, for him, when he talks about this parallax between systems, what he says appears is the concern with the transcendental, right? Both for Descartes in a way, but especially for Kant, that he also makes the same kind of, he tries to propose a genealogy of transcendental thinking out of the move between different systems, rather than a move from a system to its, let's say, atemporal structure, right?
Yeah.
You don't move between, let's say, from within a world to the question of the world, the construction of a world, because you moved from what there is to its foundations. You move to the questions of structure or transcendental structure after you move between worlds, right? In this sense, it's very kind of, all the examples that Badiou gives, and I think the one on love is the weakest in that sense, but all the examples that he gives have that exact structure of what Karatani proposes, right? Here are two worlds. I'm showing you how distinct they are, and still when you traverse them, something like raises the question of invariance, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Every example shows two different cases that, it's in between of those two cases that we can find this. In the case of the art, it's hoarseness, but in the case of mathematics, it would be like the problematic of the primes. Something that ties them together, which wouldn't be revealed simply by staying within a single system.
Yeah,
actually, what I
Reza.
want to say, as a matter of fact, I like the preface because of considering the concerns that he's addressing in the book. He proclaims that he's addressing in the book. I like the preface because he exactly lays out what his project is in the rest of the book. Like coming from being an event, we already know what a truth is. We have a clear definition of what a truth is, and in relation to a situation, he's not trying to address what a truth is. He's not even trying to address why a truth is of the material of the world. He already established that in being an event, you are taking the elements of the same situation. There is no debate on that. The problematic that he's building in the preface, I think, is the problematic of transworldliness of truths. Mm-hmm. That's the problematic. And what he's saying is that, and again, the preface is not to establish didactically that truths exist. He's not doing that, because we already know that truths exist in a given world. What he's trying to do is that truths actually of a kind of being that exists between worlds. That's why he's always comparing two different worlds, a huge contrast between two different worlds. Now, whether that's the examples that he used is a good example or bad example, that I agree with the most of the comments that were made here. I am not agreeing with all those examples as good didactic usage of or the good usage of the didactic method. Probably Plato would not be that pleased with the way that he brought these examples. But I think the way that he sets up the problematic is nice, because the question is not of the existence of truth and the exceptional status of truth with respect to bodies and languages is the problem of, or the status of truth in terms of cross worlds. That's the problematic. And number two is, what I really like about the way that he's doing, he's not starting very formally.
Yes.
he's basically bringing examples and trying to build from examples, from empirical examples, a formal theory. And that is, I find it very, very pleasing, because as I said in the comments earlier, and if you will see that in the next book, we are seeing the emergence of a formal theory, which we kind of relied on so much in being an event, but we were not witnessing this because he was borrowing this formal theory from set theory already that is built. But in this case, he's building this formal theory. So for me, it's very illuminating and very refreshing to see how he's building from these empirical examples, even in the next book that he starts from this case of Spartacus and all that. He's building a formal theory as we go along. It is a kind of thing that you find in many cases that Lautzman uses in his book between physics, theoretical physics, and mathematics. He's using these examples of physics in order to show how axiomatic, really the framework of axiomatic taken for granted in mathematics is actually prevalent in other sciences. We are witnessing the building of this from the get-go in Badiou. So for those two perspectives, I think the preface, I found it very relevant to the project of this.
Well, I agree, because even if you don't have a preface, a whole chunk of the ideological purview of the book gets lost, without the preface. Actually, you couldn't understand the placement of book one without the preface, because when you read Logics of Worlds, you think that the worlds are the issue, and the worlds are not the issue. The issue is the trans-worldly truth. So worlds are being built in order to show this transitioning of truth between them, in a sense. And the preface makes this point very, very clearly.
Yeah. One thing that I do think is worth mentioning as a sort of connection with both what you two said, and but also to give it, I think, to force a certain point continuously, which is, I think that for example, he clearly puts Deleuze on the side of, he's on my side against the problem, and he, at this last section that we read, he says, okay, but there was something that perhaps the way that he framed things allowed it to be sucked in by the contemporary ideology, and he connects it with the problem of life, right? And I think that this is something that is crucial, also just mentioning, not really going by without talking about it, because even though this is actually the sentence that I'm going to read is actually on the next section, I think it's important to mention it. He just says, look, I'm going to do something here. I need to talk about worlds because they don't follow from ontology, right? This whole thing we're going to talk about, it doesn't follow from ontology, because he wants to keep the idea that being is just this indifferent multiplicity. There is no telos of appearing in being in the sense of Hegel. Now, there is a certain telos in that sense in life, in a certain conception of life, where it's taken to be a creative power, in the sense that there is a theory of becoming where novelty is not a given in a vulgar sense, but it is in such a way connected to the rule of the world that there is no space to think of it constructively. Like, the best you can do is to serve something that you don't construct. So the combination of these two things, when he suspends the function of life as an operator of the generation of relations between languages and bodies as relations, and languages as relations, and the relations between relations, and all this this approach to becoming and change and so on, when you empty this out, I think you go even further in these logics of worlds and how sterile, I mean, it's infinite, the amount of different worlds you can produce, and still the question of transworldliness is not gonna kind of solve itself ontologically. And I think that that's really crucial, to construct a theory of worlds, which, just like the theory of just like the ontology and being an event, is very rich in the sense of it's the amount of situations you can think of it is infinite. It's really rich, but it's also radical in the sense that it empties out a certain claim as to how there is an ontological kind of tendency towards novelty, right? He wants to take that out of ontology, and then he takes it out of his theory of worlds as well, so that the question is about the sensible creation of the idea. It's not that ideas are in the same way that objects and bodies and languages, and that's just there. You have this thing developing towards something, you know. I think that that's actually very important in the way that he ends this discussion on part 7. Like, he gives us all this kind of, which actually I think are really useful when reading the examples, like to read section 7 and then reread the examples. All the things that he says, look, truths are produced and measurable in empirical time, but they can be grasped from any other point in time or any other world, or they are translinguistic. Like, everything that you could kind of, every tendency that you could have when reading the examples to kind of fix the meaning of certain terms, I think are complexified when you get to those definitions that don't really fit the intuitive meaning, you know, of the concept. And then after he does that, he says, look, let's not put too much emphasis also on what happens between worlds in a sort of organic, automatic sense. Because I think from the discussion we're having now, this could be a conclusion that, okay, so truths are between worlds. So let's get out of the way with interpreting everything abstractly, and let's kind of celebrate the singularity of worlds. And that's already being in truth in some sense, right? And this is just the first step. And there is no direct deduction from the theory of worlds. There are multiple worlds, and they are discontinuous, and they're radically discontinuous, to the theory of transtemporality of something. Like, it's not given by the same step, right? You still need to do work. Like, you could connect things in a transtemporal way, but this is not given by the fact that there are multiple worlds. There is a gap there that I think he makes a very strong case of maintaining, you know? And
I think what is important, and I haven't read those parts yet, but if within the rest of the book he's using category theory and theory of objects and bodies just to establish how, for example, events change the transcendental of each world, and how the work of the subject is basically, or truth procedures are going to, in fact, the bodies, or in fact impact the objects or bodies of in the. I don't think that any of it is new to being an event. This is not the problematic of this. Yes, this is a good thing to. We all know, and we all suffer through the theory of events in being an event. So having a new having a new basically interpretation of that, I'm looking forward to learn, actually, instead of relying on the theory of event, learning more about the transcendental and how events change the transcendental of a world. This is good, but I don't think it is new. The problem that is new in this book, as I think you guys mentioned, is that gap, and how something can crosses this gap without change, i.e. the word invariance. I think that is the new problematic of this book.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. But yes, I would just say, like, it's not like I just think it's a good point to conclude that there's a lot of effort of saying worlds are highly context dependent and not generalizable. We are discussing what either remains or is invariant or is available between worlds. But this availability, that's why I think the word availability rather than persistence is good, requires something else that is not given by the theory of the plurality of worlds, right? Again, I agree with you. This is already in being an event. the theory of situations includes the possibility of a generic subset, but it's not, this is an independent axiom, right? As the continuum hypothesis, the way that he plays with Coe and so on shows, it's an independent proposition that there are generic subsets. It doesn't follow from ZFC. So there is a gap there. That's why with Easton and so on, there are multiple ways of exploring the gap between state and situation and so on. But I think that since I'm not sure everyone in this meeting is familiar with that, I think it's useful to mention that the theory of the plurality of worlds and the recognition that there is therefore interstice, as Dennis said, between worlds, it doesn't follow that anything is, or things that relate to that gap, they persist, right? There is something to be done that makes use this, that composes something out of this availability, right? And I think that this is useful because Badiou mentioned Deleuze, and that's where I think his distinction from Deleuze is a bit clearer, and with his whole militancy approach. He does want to come up with a militant theory, with a militant sensibility, that those things are relevant for him. And I think that they become clearly relevant in this book rather than, much more than in Being an Event, where you only had that one catch phrase with fidelity and event and so on to talk about what you do with a site, what you do with things that are indiscernible. And in this book, there are many, many concepts to talk about the hard work of exploring or doing something with the gap between worlds, right? So I do think that even though I agree with you that in a certain sense everything was already done, or you can find most of this already in Being an Event, the concern with the singularity of worlds and the appearance of truth is also a different approach to the gap and to how what it means to make something out of the things that are available from one world to another, right? That is not something that is solved by deduction or calculation or even by the objective phenomenology that he's proposing.
Should we maybe take some comments from the others, perhaps? If
sure.
Yes, please. Right.
There were many questions that were raised during the discussion that were lost in the chat. I can't really.
Everybody just unmute yourselves or not. Okay, I think no.
But just
there was a question. Sorry, there was someone who asked the question about does the truth, is it created or discovered essentially, or like does it have an independent existence of, in terms of like knowledge of it, you know?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, hi. Is everybody listening?
Hey, yeah, I can hear you.
My question, I think, is the long lost question behind. But the thing was, yeah, like Dennis said, I think these ontological. I was trying to grasp the idea of this. What is the ontological nature of truths? So I asked lots of questions that I was like in my notes when I was reading it, like if truth for Badiou could be said to be something subjective, if it depends on subjects as formal procedures, or if a truth could be said to be a pattern that is just transported between situations, or if truth is, I think it is also related to all the discussions about what is an idea for Badiou, if it is just this pattern that can be transported, or if it is something different from it. I don't know. And the last question I made, I think it's also related, is if the ontological status of truth demand that someone knows it as an invariable, or if from the moment that it is created through a truth procedure, it already could be said to exist, even though no one knows that it exists. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think I follow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely one thing is that the truth must have some independent existence. Otherwise, it wouldn't be ontology, but rather like a epistemological thing, right?
Yeah, but I think the answer goes also the other way, right? The problem is that meaning that there is subjective import to it is not what makes it not ontological, because the whole thing is an ontology where the subject is included, right?
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
being an event, I think your question concerns very much the book being an event, which is the whole thing, as Reza was saying, is constructed to give meaning to the statement that subjectively participating in a process that makes something be consistent only from within that process doesn't keep it from being independent and universal, right? So, and he doesn't really give much, like when he talks about subjective, in no way does it imply inferior to your mind as a cognitive agent.
Yeah.
I think it becomes
Something
much
that is
clearer.
subjective is not that it is non-objective.
Yes, exactly. It's not the opposite of objective in that sense. I think that at the end of Logics of Worlds, this becomes, and this is the same strategy he takes all the time. Like, it becomes clearer where he stands with regards to, for example, a cognitive approach, because of how much he empties out certain cognitive categories into his objective phenomenology. So he tries to show that there are many categories that we tend to identify with the process of cognition of an individual, that they work even if you don't suppose the individual as the point of synthesis.
Yeah.
Then there is a theory of cognition to go along with that was never developed. Okay, perhaps you take cognizance of the synthesis rather than make it yourself. So there is a theory of a question of how to relate this to a more cognitivist approach, certain tendencies in naturalism today, in philosophy, that I think are not easy to transpose. But the first thing I would do if I were to follow that project would be to first kind of take stock of everything that is emptied out into what he calls this objective phenomenology, how much the transcendental constitution of a world is not something for an individual, for a perceiving subject. And then you can ask the questions about what it means to perceive, who is the subject in the sense of an individual, what is cognition. The questions will have to be reframed in very different ways, but it's good to suspend those questions for a bit, because the theory of the subject that is developed in being an event requires very little that we accept those assumptions. I do think that some of the most complicated points of being an event usually are phrased in those terms, like how does an individual recognize an event has happened? And isn't the recognition that an event happened itself an event? Isn't fidelity a matter of believing in something? And it's very easy to frame it in those terms. But I think it's a good thing to avoid, even though it's a fault of the book itself, because there are better ways to pose those questions once you understand how much you can accept as independent from that cognitive background. And then you ask the question. For example, I think that an experience that we have a lot in the circle here in Brazil that is much better framed by this approach than the regular approach is, usually in politics you would say, let's do something. I need people to believe in the same thing that I believe. That's, let's say, starting from an assumption that the idea is something that we share, subjectivity is something that we cognitively are involved in. In the circle today, we are worried about the fact that we did a lot of stuff that we don't know what it was. We're stopping and coming up with a plan to find out what it is that we were thinking. That implies the idea that cognition and thinking are separate stances, and that you're lagging behind on a process that you're engaged in, right? And you need a mediation between you and the thinking that you're part of, because one thing doesn't follow from the other. And I think that those sort of experiences, which in my opinion are very common, we're just perhaps lacking the sensibility to place them in those terms. It's an empirical experience. you are in an organization that does things that you're not doing. It's not a matter of interpretation. If it's doing what you want it to do, it simply doesn't do it. It does other things. So in that sense, that's a good phenomenon to say, okay, that phenomenon requires a theory of the subject, that where subjectivity, fidelity, true, subjective processes are not reducible back to individual cognitive capacities. And that's where I think we'll start to see the relevance of what he's doing, right? I think in art, this is clear as well. When you're doing something, you don't really know what it is that your artwork is doing. You're just following the rules you set for yourself, starting to do things that you don't know what they are. Then you step back and you are together with the spectator having to interpret what you did. So there is something going on, but what's going on is not really already coded by your cognitive relation to it or how you synthesize it. So again, this junction between your cognitive synthesis or narration, symbolization of what you do and what's going on in the processes you're involved in, this sort of approach that Badiou takes makes those things more intelligible. So that's where it's for. That's why I think it's so important to reinforce that, there is an empirical experience concerning, let's say, subjectivity in a very strange sense of the word, or creation, or invention, whatever you want to call it, right? That those are the things that if you're interested in them, I think the book is interesting generally. Without those questions, I think there are easier ways to present things. And Badiou seems to be like much ado about nothing, like don't need to do so much. If you want to talk about worlds, you can just accept like a nice analytic approach to it. It does kind of cover much of the ground already without so much formal machinery. And so I think in the question of the subject and truth, that's an issue, right? So the moment that you move the notion of subject out of this cognitive bias, then it's clearer why truths and subjectivity or invention pose a problem, right? How do you refer, and I always like to frame Badiou back into a more classical analytic approach, because I do think that he's compatible with it. How do you frame the problem of referring to artwork? Because it's clear that there is a problem with the meaning of it. You can't really find the solution to the, let's say, dynamical existence of the work by simply looking at its objective parts. You need to add something to them, but it's not really the interpretation of the listener or the spectator, neither the intention of the artist, and suddenly you are in a bit of a mess. If you want to talk about the referent of the artwork as a referent, and not simply the painting on the canvas, right? And I think that that's the sort of situation that this whole machinery is required. You want to talk about the political movement, you don't want to talk about the people or the names that they give to themselves. It's those objects, that language, plus a dynamic, that a particular way that it kind of moves, right? How do you refer to that thing? What sort of machinery do you need, and what sort of ontological commitments you need to refer to those things as real? Badiou calls that extra thing subject.
Yeah.
Right? That finite fragment of this movement. And I do think it's totally compatible with more analytic approach, like kind of giving shout to Caron here, but it's good to have that mindset, when reading this stuff, because otherwise it seems too hermetic. Like he's trying to, if you allow the formal machinery and the concept to convince you that those things exist, you get a very kind of idealized, abstract version of his theory. If you start from the fact that we have experiences of these things, and they are problems that we are we're aware and concerned with most of the time, then it's actually kind of a relief to see those things treated in this way, I think. So I think it's a good shift in perspective, otherwise, if you want the philosophy to convince you that procedures exist, it's a bad argument, or it seems to be pushing. If you already accept the existence of truth, as Reza was saying, this is not here being questioned, right? If you accept this movement, it exists in objective reality in some sense, or that you encounter it in the world, then the book is kind of a relief. You say, thank God, a frame where I can talk about correspondence, there's a computer in front of me, and that statement makes sense. I don't need like a crazy Heideggerian discussion to accept this, and I can accept that there is such a thing as a revolutionary movement. You know, I think that's a good approach to it.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, it makes sense. Yeah. I think I have, I'd say perhaps my particular ontology, and I am trying to localize Badiou's all of Badiou's scheme and formal apparatus inside of it somehow. But I think it does make sense. It is very interesting, to be honest. Thank you for the answer.
Sure, man.
Should we end here then? Or do we have any other questions?
I think it's a good point to end, actually.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so we pick up from the last section of the preface, and then we move on to book one. Hopefully, we can cover that next week. So same day, same time.
Yep.
Yeah, that works for me.
And we won't make the mistake of
Yeah.
publishing,
Yeah, we'll know better next time.
publishing a link on Twitter like that. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Great, guys. I'll upload the recording today still. I think I'm just gonna leave it converting and let you know when the video is up.
Thank
Okay.
you, guys. See
Thank
ya.
you.
Hey, thank you all. Bye.
Thank you, Dennis. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.